better idea of the color of this wine, the clarity of this wine, if there's anything floating around. All of those are things that are going to give us tips about what we're about to consume. So what we're looking for first, color. So there's a general rule of thumb. Certainly there are exceptions to this rule, but general rule of thumb that the darker that particular color, so whether it's a white wine and you've got some skewing toward yellow or straw, if you have a red wine, maybe it's a very red color or more of a brick color with a little orange or some purple undertones, whatever that color is. The darker that color, we can tend to assume that there's going to be a little bit more texture to that wine. And texture is really important. We'll talk a lot about that tonight. Coming from different sources, whether it's the grape itself, the way that it was aged, or even winemaking techniques can all increase this concept of texture or body. So it's going to give us a little more weightiness in the mouth. So that darker color might indicate a little bit more texture. The other thing we're looking at here is the clarity. So is this a wine I can see through? Now, that might not necessarily mean that if you have a red wine, it's opaque. We're going to be looking right around the rim of this glass, actually, to see how clear that wine looks. So we hope that it doesn't look a little like a hazy IPA that maybe you've encountered in recent years that seem to be all the rage right now. The idea here is we want to make sure that our bottling process has been as sterile as possible. That could cause a little bit of a haze if we had some bacteria seep in during that process. But what we should see is something fairly clear. Now, not all wines are what we call filtered, and that's perfectly all right. So if you've got a little bit of sediment that's kind of drifting to the bottom of the glass, or maybe even in suspension in the liquid, that's okay. It's just a little bit of leftover yeast or some skins residue, and that's perfectly safe. If you have an aged wine, if you've pulled something special out of the cellar, maybe you're starting to see some of the color or the tannins start to disintegrate, and that could be falling apart as well. But really what we're looking for is clarity, to make sure that wine looks nice and clear and healthy and star bright, even if it is on the dark side. So that's the first thing that we're going to look for. The other thing is, and you can kind of see this in my glass, let's see how close I can get. You can kind of see them a little bit right around the rim here. And that's what we call tears. So before we slosh it around too much, you might start to notice some tearing down the side of the glass. That can also give us an indicator about how rich this wine is going to be. Higher levels of tearing or more distinctive tearing, even staining the glass to that extent, might tell us that we have higher levels of alcohol or even some sugar present. So if you're drinking a wine that's slightly off dry, or even a sweeter style wine, you might be noticing some of that tearing as well. So that is C. The next S is actually our swirl. But I'd like everyone to do a little benchmark smell. So you're going to go ahead and stick your nose right in that glass and take a deep sniff. All right, so what I want you to think about right now in your mind, is this something I would call a super strong smell, an in-between smell, or a light smell? And the reason that we start with this benchmark smell, and you may have already been sipping a little bit, so take this into account as well. The reason we like to do a benchmark is everyone has exposure to different things today. Maybe you have some allergies. Maybe you had a candle burning in the room next door. Maybe your dinner was particularly pungent this evening. Whatever it is, you need to set an idea of where you are with your sniffer, because that sniffer is going to be really important with our tasting experience, which we'll talk about in a moment. So wherever you are, just take account of that, and we're going to watch the evolution of that wine over the course of this evening. So that's your benchmark. The next S is obviously our swirl, and I like to actually put my glass down on the table. I find it to be the safest, so I'm going to angle my computer down just a little bit so you can see. And I use my, my shoulder and my elbow to kind of create these circles on the glass. So it will literally be drawing little circles on the table to create this vortex in the glass. And the more vortex, the better. So don't be afraid unless it lands in your lap and you've gone too far. If you've got a very full glass, you can always cover it up with your hand. That's perfectly all right. So that's your swirl. The next thing you're going to do is go back to smell. So this is our next S, smell. Stick your nose right back in that glass. Take a deep sniff. All right, so the idea now is, did that smell increase? For most people, that will probably happen, not always. So if it didn't work for you, don't worry. But in many cases, we will start to see that smell increase. And that's why we do this swirl. Although it looks extra fancy pants, it actually serves a very important role in our tasting experience. So you've probably heard this term aeration, or letting the wine breathe, or whatever fancy pants term that you've heard in the past. Really what's happening here is we're just allowing for the alcohol in the wine to start its evaporation. And I know that that sounds scary because we certainly don't want to get rid of too much of that, but I promise it's not all going away. It's really just starting to come to the surface of the liquid and actually gathering in the bulb part of your glass. So if you have a glass that tapers a little bit, it does catch those aromas a little bit better, because the alcohol, due to the fact that it evaporates so easily, it actually is the vehicle by which we are able to take in the aromas. So the alcohol being exposed to oxygen will begin to evaporate. That's why we do the swirl. And underneath, so this wine has been in a bottle for a period of time. Everything's been trapped. It's kind of all absorbed, all these aromas and textures and all these things. It's been trapped in its state for a very long time. We're pouring it into a glass. And what we want is to start to allow some of these aromas, and some of them are very subtle. There's actually about 200 aromas exist in every glass of wine. So it's a lot for our brains to comprehend. We want to allow for as much of that to come to the surface of the glass as possible. So that alcohol serves as the vehicle by which those aromas are now able to make it to the surface of the liquid. So that brings us to our next S. So we've gone through our C, our swirl, and we're going to go to our smell. Smell is actually 90% of our tasting experience. Depending who you ask, 80 to 90% of our tasting experience. And that's a lot. So we always say we're going wine tasting, but we're actually going wine smelling. It just doesn't quite sound as clean as maybe wine tasting does. But wine smelling, because smell is actually our primary construct of what we think of as taste. So if you look at your taste buds, they really only can pick up certain sensations. So sweet, salty, bitter, maybe even that savory quality that we sometimes refer to as umami. So sour or tartness, all of those things are what we pick up on the tongue. We do not pick up essence of Brussels sprout or whatever other thing that we use to describe wines. So that is all a construct of both through the nose sense of smell and retronasal sense of smell. So when we take the wine into our mouth, it's sending it back up through the nasal cavity, and it's starting to trigger all of these olfactory glands that are now going to be triggering memories of things that we've encountered in the past. So that is exactly what this idea of flavor, taste, and aroma are providing for our experience with wine, is we're triggering these memories of things we've encountered in the past. Because there's way too many aromas. Granted, we're only working with grapes and yeast, maybe some oak. There's not any additional ingredients that we're adding to these wines. But because of the environment that the grapes are grown in, the style of the grapes, even the winemaking techniques, they can take on so many aromas, which is why grapes are our preferred fruit for winemaking. But that allows us to really kind of see the expressiveness of those grapes as we start to trigger some of those memories. Now, let's keep this in mind. Everyone's memories are going to be very personal to them, completely unique to every individual. So despite the fact that we love hearing about certain wine reviews and we read the back of the bottle and they tell us all these cool things that the wine is supposed to smell like, everyone's experience is going to be slightly different. So you need to remember that it's not going to be exactly the things that you're going to pick up. That's one person's experience. So I encourage everyone to take the time to sit and think about their wine, let it trigger those memories, let it take you to some place, let it remind you of things that you like or don't like, and start to gather some of that information as you go forward so that next time you pick up a bottle that's similar, or maybe a similar grape or a similar region, you know what to expect. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Because that's the most important thing, right? Do you like it? So that's why we do the swirl and the smell. Now you're probably wondering, when the heck do we get to drink these wines? We've finally arrived. So we are at the sip followed by the savor. Those are our last two S's. So take your first couple of sips if you have not sipped already. I always say that the second sip is the most pure. This allows for us to kind of reset our palate. We're doing that retro nasal smell. Maybe anything that had been in your mouth in the last couple of hours might still be lingering there. So we're setting it all straight. So that second sip is really going to give you that best experience. All right. Any questions about the 5 S's before we move on?
Serena, could you just say what the 5 S's are again?
You bet.
I got a little lost with the sniff.
That's quite all right. So, and also if you have your tasting sheet, I think they're at the bottom of the tasting sheet too. So if you got that available to you, you've got a little extra backup, but of course I will remind you. So the first one is C. Next one is swirl. Next one is smell, sip, and savor. And the reason I've separated the sip and the savor, the sip, allow for it to sit in the mouth for a little bit. And I really should mention too, especially with red wines, but this applies to white wines too. You might even want to like move it around in the mouth a little bit. So instead of just letting it sit there like on the top of the tongue and then swallowing, maybe slosh it around just a little bit and see how it coats the mouth, because what we're looking for here, so not only are we sending it back up through the nose, but we're looking for sensations. Is it triggering any tingling along the jawline? Is it a red wine and it's kind of coating my mouth with that kind of chalky or velvety texture? All of those things are going to apply to, did I like that experience or not? And then also tell us a lot about those grapes and how those grapes were handled.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Who else has got a question? Anything? Okay. I'm going to let you enjoy your wines for a moment. We're going to talk a little bit about France. So we're going to go through a little tour of the eastern part of France and do like a little circular tour. So the reason I wanted to do this, I think it's really interesting because as I mentioned, Lafayette was born in the Auvergne area of France, which is like South Central. And South Central France at one point was very, very important to the wine industry. That's really changed. So we kind of have this, if you were to look at a wine region map of France, they all kind of go in this circle. So they're all kind of close to the coasts in some way and depend on these very large rivers. Now, the central area, you don't really see a lot of wine regions anymore. But historically, these regions were dependent on traffic flow. So a lot of it had to do with trade. So in this particular area, Auvergne, being South Central, it was on a tributary of the Loire River. And the Loire River is still very important today, and we're going to talk more about that. But it was on this little tiny side section of the Loire River, and it all flows. So in the case of this region, it would be flowing north, and then it would flow west out toward the Atlantic. So north and then west. So it would take a little jaunt to the west after going north toward Paris. So due to the fact that this was a very steady flowing river, it was a very important part of the of tourism and also trade in early years of winemaking. This is also where a lot of royalty would set up summer homes. This was a very popular area for game hunting and is known for just being in general very beautiful. But because of that very strong flow of the water, and the Loire River is actually named for the term that means like silt, because there's a lot of sandbars due to the fact that it's so free flowing. In fact, so free flowing, I read that they would take these boats from the end of the river, take their wares, and then once it got to the Atlantic Ocean, they would have to take the boats apart, ship them back to the start of the river, and start all over again. They couldn't go back the opposite direction. It was one-way traffic only. So due to the fact that this was a popular route for travel, this particular region, Auvergne, was one of the most popular regions for growing grapes. Now, I'm going to put this in perspective. This is a tiny little region in the south central part of France, surrounded by land. It's about 50 miles square, so it's not a huge area, or at least 50 miles long. It might not be quite square, but 50 miles long. And it's volcanic, which is not a huge kind of topographic site within France, but this particular region, the last time I think these volcanoes were active was about 6,000 years ago. But that being said, we have some elevation, we have very interesting soil structures, lots of different types of stones and minerals that we're applying to these wines, and they were all mostly light red wines. So these light red wines would be carted along in the boats, and this became a very popular region for wine consumption for Parisians. So right around the mid to late 1800s, it was the third most producing wine region in France, and especially popular in Paris, because that was one of the first stops. So very, very common. What was the downfall? Why is it not popular today? So this was an interesting topic for me to kind of research, because I didn't actually know a lot about why did it fall apart. So a lot had to do with something that I like to talk about a lot, because it really impacted the European wine industry, and that's something called phylloxera. And phylloxera is probably exactly what it sounds like. It's a scary bug. So the scary bug attaches to the roots of these vines and actually sucks the nutrients from the vines, killing the vines fairly quickly. And this was unknown to France and the rest of Europe. But around the time that we had explorers arriving here in the United States, they were quickly looking to make wine that was equivalent to what they knew back in France and Spain. Unfortunately, we didn't have the same grape varieties here. So we had lots of vines, but we didn't really have the same quality grape varieties that produced wine that was very comparable. So they weren't sure if this was an issue with climate. They didn't know if it was an issue with the grapevines particularly. But they basically said, here, we'll send you some of these vines, you send us some of those vines, and we'll plant them here and see what happens. Well, the vines from France did not survive, and they thought, oh, great, we figured it out. It's a climate problem. It's too cold. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was that the grapevines that existed here in the United States on the East Coast, they had all gathered up an immunity to the phylloxera bug, while the European grapevines that we use for winemaking, even to this very day, did not have any immunity to the phylloxera bug. So when those vines came over to the United States, suddenly we have full exposure and those grapes died out, but nobody knew that that was the problem. Meanwhile, if you remember, we also sent them some grapevines. That was a big boo-boo, because what ended up happening was that that bug started to be spread around France very quickly, and this was in the late 1800s. So we ended up having a situation where it started to spread from wine region to wine region, going down to Spain, to Italy, even down to what we would consider more New World wine regions. We've seen it in Australia, we've seen it in New Zealand, it's been here in the United States. So anywhere we're growing the European grapevines, we have had trouble with phylloxera, with a few exceptions. So in the late 1800s, this was a huge panic, because France was the premier wine growing region of the world. And certainly they couldn't be without wine. What in heaven's name would we do? So right around the turn of the century, this particular region, the Auvergne area, was basically decimated. It took out about 2/3 or 3/4 of their wine industry, which was kind of the beginning of the problems. So phylloxera was a huge issue. The next issue was train travel. So once we started to see more train travel, certainly that meant that big regions like Paris could get access to wines that were equally affordable, but they could get them from anywhere. So this allowed for regions like Provence to be much more popular, and they weren't only dependent on Auvergne for their wine production. That allowed them to bring in slightly different styles. So that was a huge problem. Suddenly, their market was starting to be a little dried up. Another problem was we had the First World War. At the time, we had a lot of women working in vineyards, and certainly that shifted their attentions toward other types of work. And that actually remained true as other industries started to come about. So I even read something about the Michelin Tire Company had a huge impact on this region because suddenly people were able to make more money by working in a factory. So there was a handful of reasons why this particular region suddenly fell out of favor in terms of wine production. So despite the fact that it had a very unique geographic location, its topography was very special with its volcanic influence, it didn't end up being something that lasted for very long. Certainly right after phylloxera, they started to see a shift even in their grape varieties. So prior to phylloxera, they were mostly focused on the grape Pinot Noir, and we'll talk a little bit about their neighbor Burgundy, which is where that originated. But Pinot Noir did very well here. The problem was that it was not quite as hardy when it came down to phylloxera. So they started to plant more Gamay, and Gamay is from the region of Beaujolais, which we'll also talk about today. So Beaujolais is known for that particular grape. They're very similar. It's just a little bit more hardy with certain conditions. So they started to double down on Gamay because suddenly some of the bigger regions within France were needing access to wine. And although Auvergne was able to hang in there for a handful of years, they did eventually succumb to phylloxera problems. But when they were still on their feet, they were able to double down on Gamay. So suddenly we're having a shift in even their wine styles. And to this day, Gamay is their primary growing grape. So we had to kind of reintroduce ourselves to this particular grape and its region. So why are we suddenly re-looking at Auvergne? So I have a few theories. So one of them is we're starting to see more of an interest in new unexplored regions or re-explored regions. So we're getting some indication, especially from younger consumers who really want a lot more of an experience. They want a cool cocktail. They want an unusual beer, a craft beer, or they want a wine from a region that they've never heard of, or a region that they've never tried before, even a style they've never tried before. I work with college students, and it's amazing how many of them are interested in trying what we call a skin contact or orange wine. They're very interesting and can be very difficult to consume, but they're so intrigued by that experience, just even trying it once. So that, I think, brings up a very interesting point about Auvergne, which is that this is a volcanic region and it provides mineral soils that we don't always see. So there's no such thing as a volcanic wine, but certainly volcanic soils can impact the way that those grapes grow. And suddenly there's a lot of interest in these volcanic regions. So That's one of the reasons we're starting to see more interest. The other reason is that there's a lot more interest in what we would call a natural wine. And we do see a pretty good percentage of the families that are still growing or are now growing in Auvergne to use sustainable practices or natural winemaking techniques. And I think that that has helped to increase their visibility as well. They also recently hosted a wine fair, the first in many, many years. And I think that that's also bringing more attention to them as well. And the fact that Gamay is starting to take a little bit more attention away from some of the traditional French grapes that we all know and love. So those are all reasons we're starting to draw more attention to Auvergne. Now, that doesn't mean that these are real easy to find just yet. But certainly we hope, especially as we start to see temperatures change with climate change, and maybe the need for more wines grown at elevation. Most of the wines from this region are grown at 1,500 to 2,500 feet above sea level, which allows for exposure to cooler temperatures and allows for better retention of characteristics and acidity in those wines that are very important. So that brings us to our other growing regions, because certainly we have a lot of other regions that have had similar experiences in terms of its grape varieties that are right around Auvergne. So the first one I need to draw your attention to is obviously the Loire, because it's located right along that Loire Valley. So the importance of the Loire Valley is it's about 620 miles long. So it's a very long river. And this, as I mentioned, was very important for travel. And early royalty were setting up shop here, which meant that there was a lot of interest in having wine close by. The other thing that is important with rivers is that it actually helps to moderate cool conditions. So in the case of this part of France, especially as we start to get closer to Paris and basically the center of France, we're getting to an area that is a lot cooler than what we would find a little farther south in Auvergne, where that elevation is going to be very important. Instead, we want, and a little bit farther north, it might be getting even a little bit cool, which means we're mostly seeing white grapes planted. So although Auvergne was mostly red grapes, in fact, today it's 60% plus is dedicated to red grapes. I've even seen up to 80%. But in the Loire Valley proper, it's almost exclusively white grapes. So we're seeing that high level of acidity and fewer red grapes that require more sunshine. So instead we can grow those white grapes along that river. But the important thing is they're along the river, because the closer you get to those riverbanks, it can actually alter the temperature right in those vineyards up to like 4 degrees. And now that can be very important if we're really struggling to get these grapes to ripeness. So we want a nice long growing season. So this brings me to the region I want to talk about next. So when we look at Auvergne, technically it's on a tributary of the Loire Valley, but as you start to travel north into the Loire River proper, there's basically a section. So Auvergne would be in what we would call the Upper Loire. Now, as we get closer to Paris, we actually call this the center, or Center Loire. And it's not because it's in the middle of the river, it's actually because it's in the middle of the country. This is a lot closer to Paris. And certainly there were some wines there that drew special attention to that particular city as well. And that is the grape Sauvignon Blanc. And you may have heard of Sancerre. Sancerre is probably the most famous, as a lot of the Loire wines were a little bit neutral, a lot of the same stuff. Suddenly these grapes that had kind of these green characteristics, lots of citrusy qualities, that drew some special attention, especially in the 1900s, even into the like 80s or into the early 90s. We had a lot of interest in just kind of changing things up. And this provided some flavors that they weren't necessarily used to in Paris. And so suddenly this became a very popular grape variety for them, especially from Sancerre. Now, on the other side of the riverbanks is a region we call Puy Fumé, and Fumé refers to smoke. And there's a few reasons that it could have been called Fumé. One might be the fact that it's a lot closer to mountains, which allows for a little bit more of kind of this fog coverage. So that may look a little bit smoky, but probably the reason that they refer to it as Fumé, both Sancerre and Puy Fumé have what's called silex, or basically bits of flint that run through the soil structure. It's a lot of limestone and chalk, really allows for a lot of drainage, which makes the acidity a little bit more present in these wines. But what's funny is, despite the fact that we do research and have determined that we don't exactly absorb flavors or characteristics through the soil, some of these wines can kind of get this smoky quality, especially on the Puy Fumé side. And those wines tend to be a little more fuller bodied than their neighbors across the way in Sancerre, but both of them are made 100% from Sauvignon Blanc. So you might notice some green qualities that comes from a characteristic called pyrazines. And those pyrazines are basically the same chemical compound that we find in like green pepper and mint and basil and all sorts of other green vegetables. So it's not uncommon to start to notice some of those green qualities, which gives it kind of that unique smell. It might be kind of gooseberry-like or honeydew melon, totally common for that particular grape. Again, Puy Fumé might be a little bit more fuller-bodied, more texture, versus the very lean style that we get over in Sancerre. So that's our Center Loire, which is our next big stop if we were to be taking that river north directly from Auvergne. Now, if we were to head towards the mountains and circle back toward Auvergne, we would be heading over to Burgundy. And Burgundy is actually not on that typical travel route. In fact, a lot of its fame came from the fact that it had been farmed by a lot of small monasteries. And those small monasteries didn't really know what was going on down the way, but what they discovered was that there's a lot of like subtle, nuanced differences just from one piece of property to the next. So they ended up having all of these different focuses in terms of what we call terroir, or basically our environmental conditions. It could be the soil structure, how much limestone, how much granite was in that soil, how much exposure to the elements. Most of those vineyards are all planted on steep slopes. The higher up the slope, the better quality that particular vineyard. So all of these different vineyards had slightly different characteristics, and this was really the encompassment of what we now refer to as terroir, or really like that recipe of environmental factors that make a wine slightly different from their neighbors next door. A whole region can have a fairly general terroir, but it can also vary in micro levels from one vineyard site to the next, even on the same property. So that's something that they started to discover. Obviously, around the French Revolution, we started to see those vineyards being dispersed to local farmers, where they have been able to take on that challenge on their own. And now today we see those vineyards being passed down from generation to generation. They still take that very, very seriously. Now, what's the relationship to Auvergne? Because it's a little bit north, but next door, this is where the Pinot Noir grape came from. Now, over in the Loire Valley, we do grow some Sauvignon Blanc, also in Auvergne. It's not quite as popular. Obviously, we have a lot more red grapes, but we do have some. Pinot Noir is one of the other grapes that we do see other than Gamay, which we'll talk about in a second. And that was the original grape that was popular in Auvergne. Pinot Noir is known for being a thin-skinned red grape. So that's really important because most red grapes have a lot of density. They're going to have fuller bodied, more tannin structure, lower acidity levels, or at least the appearance of lower acidity levels, because that tannin is known for drying out our mouths. So Pinot Noir being thin-skinned is important because We have a wine now that we can kind of see through. So if you're drinking one tonight, you might notice you could read through the other side. It's a very light color. Tannin levels will be lower, but the important thing is that the acidity level will be higher. So that lighter style wine is actually very versatile with food and has been a fan favorite throughout France for generations. So it's one of the oldest grapes that we know of in France, far, far older than even grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon, which we value today. Pinot Noir is one of their originals, to the extent that it has now mutated many times, which is why we have Pinot Gris and Grigio, Pinot Blanc, all sorts of other things. So that grape is very important. Certainly in Burgundy, we always think of red, but wouldn't you know, it's not only known for growing those Pinot Noir grapes. In fact, it is also known for growing Chardonnay. So unlike a lot of regions where we have multiple styles of wine, Burgundy is known for having just the 2 primary grapes. Chardonnay is its other grape, and actually about 60% of the grapes in Burgundy are going to be white. So despite the fact that we associate Burgundy with a red color, red wine, red stews, about 60% is actually Chardonnay. So Chardonnay is going to be fairly light here, very low oak influence, allowing for that acidity to be very present there as well. Moving on down, we're headed over to Gamay country, which is Beaujolais. And most people have an association with Beaujolais that it produces Beaujolais Nouveau. So if you've heard of Beaujolais Nouveau, you are not alone. And certainly they do produce it there. I actually like to focus on the Cru Beaujolais. So it's a little bit more traditional style versus that kind of light, bright style that we get first harvest or first production from our year's harvest. Beaujolais Nouveau is a very fast fermentation style, but they can also make it through traditional style as well. And Gamay and Pinot Noir are actually very similar. In fact, they used to grow interspersed throughout Burgundy, but they were eventually banished down to Beaujolais when it was still these provinces. And Beaujolais had more granite soils, which actually worked a lot better for Gamay grapes. So that ended up being their one grape that they focus on, and they can be amazing and delightful. And that is the grape that we now see today in Auvergne. So Gamay grapes, still fairly light, a little bit more juicy, but still good acidity structure and very easy to pair with foods. The last region I want to talk about is actually going to be the Rhone Valley. So Auvergne has been grouped together with another region called the Rhone Alps. The Rhone Valley actually stems from part of the Alps, and a lot of glacial melt is part of the river that runs through that area. In the north part of the Rhone, which is basically just across the way, I think it's probably an hour's drive from Auvergne. So it's mostly Syrah production. And the southern part of the Rhone, as we start to get closer to the Mediterranean Sea, we see a lot more Grenache. Syrah is a much deeper style of grape. And as we're getting a little bit closer to the Mediterranean Sea, we're getting a little bit warmer inch by inch. But the Rhone Valley is known for having very steep, rocky slopes that can be very difficult to grow on. But that Syrah can be very dark and inky and lots of smoky qualities and even some savory qualities as well. All right, so that brings us right back around into a circle, back to Auvergne. Can I answer any questions about any of the regions? All right.
Could you speak to the differences in the Chardonnays in the Burgundy region as you kind of move from south to north?
You bet. So as you are farther south, you have slightly warmer conditions, which means that the grapes get a little bit riper. As you go all the way north, many people don't remember that Chablis is technically part of Burgundy. Chablis is several hours away from the northern part of Burgundy proper. And Chablis is actually right next to the Champagne region. So Chablis is one of the primary Chardonnay growing regions of Burgundy. It's 100% dedicated to Chardonnay. And that's actually because of its cool temperatures and very chalky soils. In fact, this has kind of these old crushed oyster shells right underneath the surface. As some of those soils break away, sometimes you can see them in the soil. And that's due to shifting throughout time and what used to be an old ocean underneath, bringing some of that stuff up to the surface. But that allows for really high levels of acidity, to the extent that Chablis can sometimes even be confused with a place like Sancerre growing Sauvignon Blanc. That high level of acidity, that freshness, that mouth-watering quality is very prevalent in that region, versus as you start to move farther south, we might see more and more usage of oak. Really depends on the subregion, but we don't usually see a lot of oak, if any at all, in Chablis. They're gonna harness that freshness. Burgundy, you might see a little bit. So they don't use tons. It's still a fairly light style is their mission. But as you get farther and farther south, those grapes will get a little bit more ripe. They're gonna get a little more tropical. Also, as the soil structure shifts. So Chardonnay tends to like a little bit more of the marl style. So it gets a little bit more texture under a marl soil. In the limestone soil, which actually does a lot better with Pinot Noir, it's a lot fresher, so it's a lot higher acidity. But as we get into warmer climates, we also allow for higher levels of like tropical fruit. So instead of having more citrus, we can start to see it get a little bit more pineapple-y, or even other tropical fruits and melons present there as well. Good question.
Aside, I happen to be drinking a 2014 in Chablis tonight, since I didn't have the one you had put on there, and it's still drinking very, very, very well.
Awesome.
I could have left it in the cellar a while longer, but yeah, so it is a little lighter. Chablis are actually also oaked less.
Almost
than the Chardonnay
none.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah, Chablis is almost exclusively unoaked. I would say that there is a rare few at the Grand Cru level that for some reason they think that it would be interesting to oak, which is unfortunate, because if it's the best quality vineyard in the whole property, certainly you would want to showcase what's so special about it. But that's why they're so high acidity, is that they're not using any oak. Sometimes that can make it difficult to differentiate. Is this Sauvignon Blanc or is this Chardonnay? Very, very similar. Awesome.
Hi, my wine shop had all three of your recommendations, so congratulations.
Awesome.
But nothing from the Auvergne, and we talked a little bit about it, and the guy there is pretty knowledgeable. Their wine specialist at the shop was pretty knowledgeable, and he said, yeah, it is coming back a little bit, and he had a couple of ideas. I said, well, you can turn your ideas into getting me some, but you know, obviously we have to talk about price and how much you can discount a case and all that sort of thing. So, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about a recommendation or two from that region.
From Auvergne?
Yeah, since we're all Lafayette people and we have to try and do Lafayette things.
You know, I was talking to Adrienne before we started, and I wish I could tell you that there was like some really great source for them. They're really hard to find. So I would stick to these stores that are kind of obscure. I did find one at Astor's that is based in New York, but that will ship, and they call it some kind of volcanic Gamay. So there are a handful out there. There's a few Chardonnays that I track down, but any of the big retailers generally do not carry them.
That's interesting because the pandemic has made New York not a place I need to go to, even though my office is there.
Stay home.
Even though my office is there. But I'd be interested to know which wine shop that was, because I will be going back to New York.
Oh yeah, so Astor's has one.
Astor Place?
Astor Wine and Spirits.
Yep, got it. Yeah, I know.
And I think that we included that in our write-up. So
okay.
Hopefully it's
very
still
good.
there. But I did find one there, and I think there were a few other very obscure shops that I found that had one, but nobody that had 4, 5, 6 options. I really had to hunt. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. Any other questions on the regions or wine in general that I can answer? And then we'll do a little sharing if anyone wants to share what they're drinking.
There was a question. Drink wine.
There was a question from Lynn who said, what about the wines from Bordeaux, specifically Saint-Emilion?
Great, so that's a great question. So Bordeaux is on the other side. So the other end of the Loire, if we were to take that Loire all the way down to the end, it would be very, very close to Bordeaux. Bordeaux's a little bit farther south. So it's right along the Atlantic. And what I love about Bordeaux, so it's historic because of the fact that it also was on one of these routes where they did a lot of trade. In fact, early trade there was, it was like mostly textiles. So that was how those wines started to get on the ships and go over to England. So that was kind of the beginning of what became famous Bordeaux. And Bordeaux is known for its mixture of 5 grapes. So it's 5 noble grapes as of today. And I say as of today because we're starting to see movements toward maybe bringing in additional grapes from places like Spain that are going to be a little bit more hardy as we see temperatures rise over the years. So they're already starting to think about that. But traditionally we have 5 grapes, and the 5 grapes are Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Malbec. And sometimes we see some Carmenere, although that's mostly been phased out. So those 5 primary grapes are the ones that we see in Bordeaux. And what's interesting is most of the wines from Bordeaux are blends. So they're going to be a blend of those handful of wines or grapes. And the reason for that is that all of those grapes ripen at different points. So if we were to have a rough storm come through, remember we're right along the Atlantic Ocean, it can be very stormy. They do have a forest that blocks a lot of those bad storms from coming into that region. The region that is most growing Cabernet Sauvignon is a little more rocky, so it drains a little bit better. Merlot is a little bit more hardy, so they tend to plant that on what we would call the right bank, where we have more clay soils, because they can withstand a little bit of soggy roots that Cabernet Sauvignon just can't. But the blend of the two is very important, because if you had a rough year or a certain harvest didn't work out, you could still rely on some of those other grapes. And together, they always saw this as a way to provide a little bit more complexity to their wines, because each one was providing something slightly different. Cabernet Sauvignon has very, very small grapes, which means that the tannin levels are very high because we've got less juice per grape and more skin. Whereas Merlot is a little bit fatter. They have the same parents, as it turns out. So Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon are almost identical in terms of characteristics, except that Merlot is a little more hardy and is a fatter grape. So Saint-Emilion is one of these regions that allow for slightly easier to consume wine styles that are mostly going to be Merlot based. So they still age really, really well. But for the most part, if I wanted to pour one a lot earlier than maybe my Bordeaux that was mostly Cabernet based, I would have to wait a little longer for the Cabernet one than I would for the Merlot one. Great question. Somebody found the volcanic wine from Astor's. Nicely done. Any other questions about wine that I can answer for you? Anyone want to share something that they are drinking that they really liked, that they would like to recommend to the rest of us?
Feel free to unmute to share your wine.
Back. And this is Mike McClintock. I'd be curious for you to comment on a little known wine region in France. It's like, is it Mandarin? That Tannat is the primary grape.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about that region. I do know a lot about Tannat. So I can tell you that Tannat is a grape that has mostly grown in regions where it's a little wetter. And the reason that it's so hardy is it has a lot of really solid wood, and the vines dig down a little bit deeper. So the concern about it getting kind of waterlogged is not so much a problem. The issue though is due to the fact that it grows in some of these regions, it develops a very thick skin, and it makes it harder for them to produce wines that are very presentable. Due to the thick skins, can be very tannic for some people. But the brilliance of that grape is that it has a lot of similarities to Bordeaux grapes, but the fact that it is a little bit more conditioned for wet climates, which means that South America has started to adopt Tannat.
So particularly Uruguay, where they get the wine region, and with Uruguay gets a lot more rain.
That's exactly where I was going.
That holds moisture, as opposed to Argentina, where Malbec is better because it's much drier. By the way, this is a Mandarin.
Nice.
80% Tannat right here. You can see it's pretty inky.
Oh, totally.
And the two other blending grapes are both the Cabernets in equal amounts, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc.
Yeah, it helps to soften it. That's awesome.
Yeah, this is a great one. It was rated 93 by Wine Spectator.
Great.
And at least here in Arizona, you can get it for $15 at
hey, what a deal.
It is.
What a deal. No, some of my favorites are the ones coming out of Uruguay. I've had some good conversations with some of the families growing grapes down there, and it's been a life changer for them for sure.
We have a couple more questions. We have Brian from Michigan. Is there a way to detect if there is purple agent in a wine before drinking it?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. So I wish that there was an easy way to do that. I would say the best way to try and avoid them, although it is not a surefire way, is to try and spend just a little bit more. So I always say that the happy price point for me is, $12, maybe $15 to $20. As you get lower in the price range, due to the fact that they're utilizing grapes that are maybe blended or less than ideal in terms of its growing conditions. Mega purple is a common use for those wines simply because it creates a color that seems more attractive to people, but it definitely does not reflect, certainly like a Pinot Noir would not reflect the way that you would want it to be. So I always encourage people, if you spend a little bit more, usually you can start to get into some producers that are a little more craft focused. So you're looking at smaller producers versus the very large ones, and they typically are not using mega purple. They're pretty into their art, but it's still not completely 100% surefire way to know. Good question. I wish we would start moving toward listing all ingredients to kind of suss some of those out, but I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Linda and Andrew from Pennsylvania would like to know, can you explain the main differences between natural wines, organic wines, and quote, regular France? From
France. So specifically from France. So those are all good questions. So all countries have slightly different rules about what makes an organic wine. Natural wines usually refer to less intervention in the winery. And I would say natural, it depends what you constitute as natural. I think today when we think of natural, we think about using indigenous yeast, which means that instead of inoculating with a chosen yeast, the yeast that exists on the outside of the grape. So when you go grape shopping at the store, you might notice it's got that kind of filmy quality. It's like a little white film. It's just yeast. Yeast exists everywhere. The challenge is that sometimes those indigenous yeast can be a little bit unpredictable or provide characteristics that maybe aren't necessarily what you would want in your wine. So some people choose to still choose a yeast that will then be inoculated to make sure that it's a nice, smooth fermentation process. But natural tends to refer to just allowing the existing yeast to do its job. So that tends to be one thing. Other things that they maybe don't do, they probably don't use quite as much sulfites or little to none. I do want to note sulfites are used at a fairly small percentage in wine production, and it's getting increasingly smaller. But when we get into organic wines, there are rules about how much you can use. And in the United States, it's almost zero. But in other countries, they allow a lot more to still count as organic. So the restrictions are higher in the US than they are in France and Italy. So organic wines can also refer to, other than winemaking techniques, organic wines often get confused for organically grown grapes. And organically grown grapes have their own set of rules and restrictions, which just means that they are not spraying with inorganic fertilizers. They're really focusing on things that are organic. That doesn't always mean that they're really great for us. So it just means that they're organically derived. It could still mean that there's like copper and other things being sprayed. And that's not hugely uncommon in France. I don't think they use it a whole ton, but certainly in regions where they're struggling with pests or molds or other types of rots that might be problematic, that might be what they resort to, but they can still count as being organic. So I always take that term organic with a grain of salt because it could mean a multitude of things. Is it an organic wine, organically grown? Is it certified? Being certified can be very, very expensive. So certainly that doesn't tell us a whole lot. Natural, as I mentioned, usually refers to very little winemaker intervention to allow for the grapes to basically express themselves as they are. Sometimes that doesn't allow, especially in France, if we're going to import them from France into the US, sometimes the stability of those wines can be a little bit tricky. So sometimes they don't arrive here quite in the same state as we would want, but certainly they do make a lot of them. And then regular wines, there's a wide variety of what we'd refer to as regular. I think most regions are practicing some form of sustainability. In France, they're very focused on this concept of terroir and reflecting the land, upholding heritage that we don't necessarily talk a lot about here in the US. Whereas here in the US, we're all about that winemaker or that one grape or that one region that is kind of got this cult following. Whereas in France, you know, they don't even tell us the grapes on the bottle. They just want us to know what the region is, how long it's been there, what the history is of that particular region. But certainly the overseeing rules about those regions are far stricter than what we see here in the US. We don't really have rules about what grapes I can grow, when I can pick my grapes, what the alcohol content can be of my wines, the sugar levels of the grapes when they get picked. All of those are really determined by the government in France, whereas in the US, we don't have any of those rules. Does that answer your question?
Don't you think that terroir is really, really important, though? My God, if you don't know where what the soil is like, you know, the grapes are grown in, I mean, you're missing one of the essential parts of what this is all about. I mean,
it is.
I can remember going on tours in France, and the tour guide, or if in some cases it was the owner, would actually pick up and put his hand in the soil and have you do the same thing, and to just emphasize, if you did that in 3 different wine growing regions, you might have 3 different sensations. Absolutely. And he even said, take one with you if you want and try it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty
That's
easy.
awesome. And the thing is, you know, we talk a lot about soil, but it's all of the environmental impact. So the slope of that particular vineyard, what might be a little more slope than the other, and the exposure to the sun, which way does it face? And To me, I refer to that as like the environmental recipe, because each vineyard plots can be slightly different, which is why, especially when we look at Old World and grapes like Pinot Noir or Gamay that really reflect that terroir, that slight differentiation from one vineyard site to the next can mean that that grape tastes very, very different. Versus I think in the US, we're really much more focused on what the grape is, who the winemaker is, and did it taste the same as last year? And can I drink it now, right?
Yeah, good point. I'm not, the fascination with who the winemaker is so typically American. You know,
It is. And
France,
even the single varieties, right? So we invented this concept of just Cabernet or just Merlot.
Right.
They didn't really, there's certain regions that do that, but they certainly don't label their bottles that way.
You're right.
We did that.
Oh, it's in a way, it's a point of differentiation for the French too. They can't say their Cabernet is different than Cabernet in the US per se. They can only say, well, terroir is what it's all about, right?
That's what it's all about.
That's what makes what makes our wine better than all those other wines.
Oh,
so
wow.
And of course, I'm a amateur winemaker myself, although I do make wine with professional winemakers to make sure I don't mess it up. But I want to compliment you. I'll have to say, I mean, you know, I've traveled throughout the world and throughout the country. I've been to France several times, as an example. And I've not encountered many people who have the knowledge that you have. So my question is, and I'm very impressed. So how did you get all that knowledge?
So I landed in this industry by accident. So I was a journalist first and then ended up in marketing strategy. I went the whole way thinking I was going corporate, and I did for a while. But early in my career, I had to interview some local winemakers in Santa Barbara. Really kind of fell in love with the story of winemaking, not just the people, but the history, the grapes, all of those things. Just, I was bit by the bug. And so I asked for a Saturday job at one of these wineries I interviewed, not really knowing what I was walking into. And I was completely green. I didn't know anything. And I just kept asking questions. I'd stay late. I'd follow the winemakers around. I'd volunteer for harvest. I'd clean out barrels on my spare time. And I mean, it really started me down this road that I didn't expect. And, you know, now I do all these very silly exams, but really what my love is learning about new regions and then being able to share that with other people. So it's really just fueled by curiosity. I think I'm still a journalist at heart. I'm still telling stories. They're just specific to the wine region these days. So tip of the hat, I appreciate that. That's very kind of you.
When you talked about, you know, getting into it and volunteering to go to the harvest. My daughter decided she'd had enough of New York and working at the pension trust department of Chase Manhattan Bank. So she decided one fall, I'm going to go to France, pick grapes, and meet up with my boyfriend, who's Dutch, in Holland at some point. So she went over there, and of course she was a week late for the harvest. She went to Burgundy for some reason. And it's a very funny thing, but she sort of turned my wife and me on to going to the actual wineries, where in whatever country you're in. Mike McClintock mentioned he's traveled all over the world, so have I. And there's just nothing like being able to go where the wine is produced, whether it's some obscure winery in Hungary or in a not so obscure winery in South Africa. You know, when you've had the chance to go to all those places and experience the, you know, drink the wine at the source and that sort of thing, really is a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And if you can avoid becoming a complete, you know, wino, it's even better.
Worst things, right?
Now, another question I have to ask is, have you had any wines made from grapes grown in Arizona?
Yes. So I lived in Arizona for a while.
Oh, you did?
I did. I lived in Tucson. My husband got his PhD there. So I know a lot about Arizona wines, particularly in the Wilcox area, which was where most of the wine was being made at that time. It's still growing. It's been guess 6 years since we lived there, but I certainly was down there a lot at that time. I was already teaching wine at that point. So.
All right. Well, I'm impressed that you know about Arizona wine.
I teach a lot about Arizona and Texas, actually. So
Okay.
I think that those are interesting regions to talk about, and certainly a surprise to a lot of people.
Well, living here much of the year and having an interest in wine, I've made a lot of wines from Arizona grapes. In fact, your story is very similar. The story of how you got where you are. You may want to go own a winery next if you're like this person.
Don't tell my husband that.
A guy named Joe, Joe at Chateau Tumbleweed here in Joe Bouchard. Jeez, just went blank on his last name for a second there. Anyway, he was a journalist too when he first came here, and he got the wine beat. He got the wine beat for the newspaper, and then ultimately he got the bug and started working part-time in wineries here, and then became an intern at a winery where we were making wine at the time with some not him, with somebody else, but ultimately he left, started his own winery, and we started making wine with him at
That's
Chateau
cool.
Tumbleweed. But anyway,
awesome.
It's kind of interesting how he went from journalism and kind of sales and marketing stuff to making wine.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
You know, we have wine industry in Connecticut, but I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. It's just,
There's wine in all 50 states.
Every state,
these
you
days.
got it. Every state
Every
has
single
it.
state.
Every state has weird rules about alcohol and wine and all that stuff. But it's interesting. It is a tourist thing in Connecticut. There's a couple of wine trails, and you can spend a day doing it. And if that draws tourists and it gets people to come to the state, so much the better, I guess. But I can't say much for the quality of the wine.
Fair enough. Any other good questions for me?
Serena, thank you so much. Really appreciate all your knowledge and sharing, particularly your knowledge about the wines from France. Folks, I see a lot of you are throwing recommendations into the chat. I'll make a copy of that. We'll be sending out a survey tomorrow to get your feedback about this event, and I'll include everyone's recommendations on the side there.
They're looking great. I've been peeking over there.
I'm just seeing, make sure if there isn't any more questions. Again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You all, if you want to throw out your website name, I think it's drinking.com.
That's right. I can put it right in the chat. There we go. I would love to see you all again, and I thank you, Janine and Adrienne, for inviting me to be here. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the weekend and rest of Rivalry week as well.
If you talk to Matt Pagano, who's on this chat, and to Janine,